Alright, I'll do it this way. I'm not actually annoyed. So this guy's video is an hour long, and I'm going to be looking at pretty much all of it. I agree with the topic. I disagree with the reasons. Man, I've been holding off on talking about Five Nights, for multiple reasons. I have a script in progress for a my thoughts on video for all of the games, and good God, there's a lot to talk about. But I found this video randomly by chance, and I just had to respond to the points here because, like I said, I agree with the topic. Sister Location is not a good game by any stretch of the imagination, and I agree with some of the reasons he gives, but not all of them. Let's just get into it. So, I watched this with a friend, recorded the whole interaction, edited the entire thing down into 3 parts, and released part 1. And people didn't like it, and I understand why. I was reacting to it live, and by that I mean no script. I don't do well live, and I've said multiple times over and over that I do better when I script myself. But I thought I was being lighthearted with it and made the title the eye-catching clickbait title that is the only way to get any kind of attention on YouTube. Seriously, YouTube actively promotes videos with clickbait titles more than any others. Fucking website. But yeah, I did all of that and the video fell flat. And I probably am in the wrong for that, so I apologize. And I will rectify that with this video. But I wanted to be understood. My overall opinion has not changed. I do think Uhyeah is wrong. So this guy, I'm not saying Uhyeah over and over, it's weird to me, made this hour-long video talking about why Sister Location is a bad game. We'll go into it piece by piece and tackle what he says as we go, and while other people are talking, including him, I will be aided by my little viewport here.
There's no doubting what you've achieved on a technical level. This is clearly pushing the engine.
Accompanied by a video title and channel name. This is to ensure that proper credit is given where it is due, and to differentiate between my footage and someone else's.
I do not like Sister Location, but for the longest time, I thought I did. For years, I would look back at all the games and think of Sister Location as a standout title in a sea of repetitive back-to-back entries. I'm sure many people feel the exact same way about it that I used to, but after replaying it recently, I would be lying if I said I enjoyed my time with it at all. It's rare you play a game that you thought so highly of for so long, only to have that false reality shattered within only an hour of playing it. Sister Location is like one of those kiddie roller coasters. When you're younger, they feel like the most crazy and insane thing ever. But the more time passes, the more you realize you're a 45-year-old man, and a small rocket ship roller coaster isn't actually very interesting at all, and is in fact quite bland and boring.
Well, I'm curious to know how this relates to only Sister Location, because that's the case with all of the games. I hate to burst people's bubbles, but the Five Nights at Freddy's games are not good games.
Very quickly, Sister Location went from one of my favorites of the original Scott games to my absolute least favorite. But why? How could such a seemingly fresh and innovative entry in a series known for getting stale at points be so bad? Well, to get into all of that, we first have to look back at every FNAF game before it to understand how we got here. Trust me, it's worth getting this out of the way now, and it won't take very long. I guarantee you I can do the shaky vent part of Sister Location, just stay in place, and not get jump scared by the time this section is over.
I'm not sure what the point being made with that is supposed to be. Of course you're not gonna get jump scared. The only thing that happens in the vents is a scripted soundbite playing as you're crawling around.
Motion triggered. Circus gallery vent.
There's no way to tell what the sound is supposed to be, so it tricks the player into thinking something might be chasing them. This is fine since this is a more linear and story-driven game. You'll see this kind of technique used in a lot of games, and getting the player to scare themselves when nothing is there is not only common but often effective in the moment. So I don't see what the issue is.
That. It acts more like a strategy game where you need to keep track of a bunch of things at once to make sure you can survive the full night.
You have a grand total of 3 things that you can do. Look at cameras, use lights, and close doors, and all of these have a certain power drain. Once you figure out that you don't need the cameras and learn what the sounds mean, power management becomes a lot easier in terms of things you can control. The rest is based on the RNG for each character, and that is outside of your control. If they camp your door, there's nothing else you can do, and there's no strategy you can implement that can prevent that.
FNAF 2 has a different gameplay loop from 1, but the structure of the game and how it increases in difficulty remains the same. Each night, more stuff is added or made harder until you beat the game.
I agree with him here. What he's saying is correct, but I want to add a little bit. The reason why 2 was harder is because it forced you to be in the cameras to manage a button while dealing with either 5 animatronics at a time or just all of them by night 6. And every now and then the controls would just betray you at the worst times.
Bro, what the f was that, bro? God damn it, bro! For anybody wondering what happened there, I was trying to put on the mask, but since I had just put down the camera, the mask button wasn't actually on the screen. So when I tried to flick it down, it wasn't there, and the button wouldn't load in because my mouse was already on the spot.
As well. FNAF 4, once again, follows the basic boiled down formula for a FNAF game. Sure, it's a little different from the 3 prior games in its presentation and style of gameplay loop.
FNAF 4 is different in that it removes the cameras, so now you have to rely entirely on sound. Well, most people do. So now you just manipulate doors and shine a light. The environment is different, the way the game is dressed up is different, the way the RNG behaves is kinda different. And you have to manage the Foxy door and the mini Freddys. But on a mechanical level, the gameplay loop is the same.
After all this, of course Scott would want to try something different after 4 games in a row following the same core gameplay philosophies.
That's a bit of a long way to say. You may be thinking after all of this time that of course Scott would want to try something different after doing the same thing 4 times in a row. But anyway, yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. After I made my one video playing FNAF 4, something clicked and I said to myself, I just played the same game 4 times. Because I did. It was just skinned differently.
He decided to make a game called FNAF World. This game, while maybe not being super relevant to the conversation at hand just yet, is still an important turning point in the series to bring up. Since this game is an RPG and not a typical FNAF game, there was bound to be a whole lot more writing and a direct story compared to the previous entries.
Admittedly, I forgot about FNAF World a lot, because I never played it. I heard there was a lot of stuff that happened with it. Scott had to pull it and fix a few things, I believe. It seemed like a whole mess, but RPGs really aren't my kind of game, so I wouldn't have played it anyway.
And we finally reached Sister Location on our timeline. Now, this game is very different from the other mainline FNAF games that came before it.
It is indeed. Because of how many times Scott made the same game, it's natural to sort of shift gears and branch out to something new. And because of how the lore was handled throughout the games, Scott kinda wrote himself into a corner, and the story had to go through several rewrites. When FNAF 1 was made, it was Scott's Hail Mary attempt to make a game that got off the ground. If Five Nights at Freddy's didn't take off, that would be it. No more games. So, there was some spooky, creepy stuff hidden in the game that sparked theory videos, and from then on Scott continued to write the lore as hints in the game and hide the rest in teaser pictures and scripts and lines. The lore was almost a mystery for the community to solve, and while that was really fun and really part of the charm for Five Nights at Freddy's, it's difficult to create a coherent story like that. Up to when Sister Location was released, the lore and story around FNAF was really complicated, so it's natural to create a game that kind of recenter the story.
So, does Sister Location do a good job moving the FNAF series forward by removing the gameplay that made it so interesting in the first place?
Well, I wouldn't say interesting. When I first played the game, like everyone else, I thought the gameplay was interesting. But hindsight being 2020, it's really not. It's severely limited as a result of the engine. You're not doing much, and with how the RNG script behaves, it quickly becomes frustrating and you don't want to play it again for a very long time. That's if you're bad at it. If you're good at the game, it's just really fucking boring. But, I mean, I would say it worked well to move it forward because it did. From this spawned Pizza Simulator and Ultimate Custom Night, which really closed the overarching story with William Afton being trapped in hell, tormented by his own creations. Sorry, I tend to look at story writing a lot when looking at games. I like stories. What can I say?
I think it's about time we check back with our shaky vent. Surely something has come to jumpscare us after all this time waiting and doing absolutely nothing when there is a very clear and active threat being presented in this situation.
I have a question. What is the clear and active threat being presented in this situation? Here's the first vent crawl.
For another contender in children's entertainment. Unlike most entertainment venues.
Alright, you're accompanied by hand unit. Here's the second vent crawl.
Motion trigger, circus gallery vent.
Okay, you get a motion trigger, system knows you're there. Here's the third.
Motion trigger, circus gallery vent.
You hear a sound that you can't identify, it's just loud. The point is that it's not clear. You don't know if it's a threat or not, it's just a loud noise. And that's how I interpreted it when I played the game.
Surely this entire section isn't designed to just catch the player off guard only the first time they play the game. Oh wait, it is? Damn, okay, wow.
I mean, like I said before, there's no way to tell what the sound is supposed to be, so it tricks the player into thinking that something might be chasing them. It's a common and effective trick used in story-driven games, which this is. And as unfortunate as it may be, this is not the first, nor will it be the last time we see games use a particular scare that is only effective on a first-time playthrough.
Oh shit. What's gonna happen? Oh no!
I sure hope
I hear noises!
random event.
Ah! I'm gonna die!
Ah.
What? No, I am actively not playing the game and there is noises happening that are bad.
And this is where my first argument comes in. This isn't something unique to Sister Location. In all of the games, you can go for periods where you are actively not playing the game with noises happening and be perfectly fine, because nothing will actually happen yet. Historically, people have scared themselves in the first 2 hours of FNAF 1 and 2 Night 1, when none of the animatronics are active. If this is an issue in Sister Location, why is it not an issue in the other games as well?
And yes, that whole shaky vent section was a bit of a joke, but it does help illustrate one of my biggest issues with this game. This is by far the least replayable game in the entire series.
Argument 2, and I'll stop counting after this, I swear. Man, none of the games are replayable. Once you've chugged through Night 6 and had your fun with the custom night, you won't come back to it until a significant amount of time has passed. Because these games are really fucking frustrating and boring after repeated plays. There is nothing that kills a horror game more than a player getting frustrated at it. And this is a thing that happens in any horror game. It's the balance between horror and difficulty. Make it too difficult and the player gets frustrated and all the horror shit immediately gets ignored and there goes your scares. When you start dying over and over because you miss a button or you don't manage the power or the RNG just rakes you over the coals because Bonnie will not go the fuck away, that gets frustrating and all the scares go out the window. Side note, have you ever wondered why that happens? Here you go.
And of course, reason number 2, they just don't leave my door. Like I said during Night 1, if we just get really bad RNG, then an animatronic might not move. Since the position at my door counts as an actual moving position, If they just fail their movement attempts for a really long time, then they just stay at my door and drain my power forever.
Frictional were very concerned with maintaining the player's sense of immersion and atmosphere in their potential games. When faced with something too challenging, that fear can turn into frustration. And that is not the intention or experience of horror. It's a huge reason for why it's so complicated.
There goes your immersion. There goes your atmosphere. There goes your ambiance. Now you just want to beat the game out of spite. Hey, buddy, you know all that time you spent yelling at Bonnie and Chica to leave and how fast you had to move to keep everything from killing you? Well, I got just what you need. How about you do it again, but you set the RNG level? Yeah, no. His issue with the vent is that it's just playing a soundbite. There's no actual threat, so it doesn't need to be there. But consider what just happened up to this point. Ballora wasn't on her stage. You had to shock her and then saw that she was back. Funtime Foxy wasn't on her stage. You had to shock her and then saw that she was back. In the Circus Gallery, the light doesn't work. The player doesn't know where Circus Baby is. The shock works, but it doesn't do much to show where she is. And you shock her 3 times. Each time you never see her. But hand unit tells you to leave. The soundbite in the vent is so you know that she, in fact, was there and she's still moving around. There's more to games than just gameplay. Gameplay is integral, of course. No one is denying that. But in games with narrative, story is also important. This segment sets up the fact that something was in that room, but the shock wasn't working. This one is different from the others. That said, there does need to be a healthy balance between engaging gameplay so the player doesn't feel like they're just along for the ride or playing a walking simulator, and narrative for the story that you want to tell. A balance that Sister Location does not have.
There is a speech done by Thomas Grip, the lead designer for Frictional Games, about how story and gameplay work together in video games, and as a whole he describes the gameplay process as 1. Mechanics, the literal things you're able to do. 2. Dynamics, the things the mechanics can do when used in conjunction with each other. And 3. Aesthetics, how one dresses these mechanics to prevent players from looking at them as mechanics. He then goes on to say the story works with the gameplay in that 1. Mission scene, the objects and locations are in the game to assist with the mechanics. 2. Drama, the reason the event is happening in the moment, like Mario jumping over a cannonball, with a combination of mechanics being jumping and moving. And 3. Narrative, which builds the reason for it all happening in the first place, for example Bowser stealing Princess Peach. Now this set of rules essentially applies to all games, and how well it's constructed is incredibly important.
That when you think about this is basically, this here is what you want the player to what the player should be seeing as they're doing their stuff. And in a game like Tetris, this doesn't really matter, because it doesn't matter if the Tetris blocks are like, is it crystals, is it stone? It doesn't really matter that much to that game, because these two, like, they're very, very similar. You can play Tetris in a very abstract way. Mario loses a lot of the appeal if you remove this. You could just have squares and circles and stuff like that in a Mario game, which is this space. I'm gonna say space from now on, so we know. And the system space, so you can play Mario in the system space, but in the story space, it's harder. And the same goes for other games, like an adventure game would be very hard to play in system space, because you wouldn't know what the hell any object would be. It's very, very important that you know what the object is.
Obviously, there are several things that Grip said that don't apply to Sister Location because of how little you do in that game. But you get the idea.
Every FNAF game before this encouraged a ton of replayability, whether it be through the inclusion of a custom night to mess around with the game's core mechanics on harder difficulties, or extra challenge modes such as those found in the FNAF 4 Halloween update.
They did not encourage replayability. Just ask anyone who played these up to 420 mode on YouTube. And the challenge modes do absolutely nothing to help with this either. In FNAF 2, the challenge modes are just difficulty presets for different groups of characters at different levels, up to all 20 mode, and that gets boring after a while. FNAF 3's only challenge is Nightmare mode, and then you get cheats. FNAF 4 is really the only one that has a good challenge mode, and that's Blind mode, because it emphasizes how important it is to pay attention to sounds. The others, Mad Freddy, Insta-Foxy, and All Nightmare, are just increased difficulty, and we've been over that. A skill test, for sure, but we've been over it.
Even FNAF World has a million different endings and secrets to find that would maybe encourage the player to go through it a couple times to find everything there is to offer. Also, with the extremely large number of animatronics you can use in your party in that game, just the ability to use a different team each time encourages replayability.
Again, not gonna talk about FNAF World because RPG, but I'll throw this in. Yeah, RPGs are forever replayable because of the sheer amount of different variables that would make each playthrough different. So I would say FNAF World is the only FNAF game that has any replayability.
Sister Location, aside from its own custom night mode, which we will get to much later, lacks any replayability in a series pretty much famous for it.
So, closing argument for this replayability segment, the series is not famous for its replayability, and you are correct. This game does not have any replayability, but the others don't either. Except for FNAF World. So, if this is an issue in Sister Location, why is it not an issue in the other games as well?
Not only can you not replay any of its minigames on their own for some reason, but the game is absolutely littered with scripted events that become more and more obnoxious the more you play the game.
Well, it has scripted events because it's a linear story-driven game. The game is made to tell a story, and you're viewing that story through the eyes of Michael Afton. Of course, things are going to be scripted.
The Shake event, for example, would have been a really easy section to turn into actual gameplay rather than a scripted event. You're trapped in this tiny vent, trying to get out, and all of a sudden, you're a bunch of loud noises and the vent begins to shake. In the actual game, this is just a cheap scare that adds nothing to the overall game really. But if the gameplay was put first here, there could have been something really similar to the tiny vent music men from Security Breach.
When you're making a game like this, and you decide to make a part be a portion with gameplay, it's important to put the gameplay segments where it makes sense. This vent is a transition point between set pieces, the service crawl space, and the circus gallery control room, and this is Night 1, which you yourself said is usually made to acclimate the player to the game without much trouble.
Sister Location insists on treating itself like some kind of free roam game. You have to use WASD for pretty much every single movement action.
Yes, those are the universal movement controls for every game ever that doesn't use the arrow keys.
Including pressing W to go forward in the vent.
Oh my god, you can press W too? In the vent? Holy shit.
Instead of this stupid vent section being just for spooks and not actually dangerous in any way, give the player the ability to turn around in the vent to look behind them.
I remember watching an E3 interview with one of the guys that worked on Soma. He was asked what he thought made science fiction a good theme for a horror game. He said this. In any horror game, it is integral that you have your world be believable. Even things as minor as things you can do in an event. If people start noticing that your game isn't believable, that can spell the death of your game and the world that you're trying to create. And I don't know if you've ever been in events like that, but... well, have you ever seen Die Hard?
Come out to the coast, we'll get together, have a few laughs.
It's like that. You ain't turning around in them. I'm not saying that this game is perfect. and the world is super believable. It has its problems, but we don't need to add to the problems.
Turn this boring, pointless vent section into a minigame where you need to turn around every time the shaking happens to scare away the biddy babs, making the ruckus at the end of the vent. It doesn't even need to be a very long gameplay section, but it at the very least adds more gameplay to the game overall. It makes it less of a snooze fest on repeat playthroughs. Instead of, oh boy, time to go through this stupid vent again and hear the scary noises, it turns into,
oh boy, time to play a minigame that honestly doesn't need to be here. I really don't think the vent is that much of an issue. You're not in it for very long, it serves as a transversal from one set piece to another, and if it's that much of an issue for you, why is the other vent from the elevator to the service crawl space not an issue? Does that need to be a minigame as well? Is the only issue with this vent the fact that it plays a soundbite when you go through it? I really don't think it's that much of a problem.
oh boy, time to play this part of the game again in this video game that I enjoy and respect.
Okay, relax.
To do with the game itself, really. We gotta talk about the box art. Well, okay, it's hard to call it box art when it's really just the cover for the digital game, but you know what I mean.
Yep, I know exactly what you mean. It's called cover art.
Let's take a look at the box arts for every FNAF game up until this point. Except for FNAF World, because literally, who cares? FNAF 1, Freddy Fazbear is front and center. Makes sense, it's the first game, and he's literally the namesake of the series. FNAF 2, Withered Freddy. Once again, makes sense, and looks a lot better than if Toy Freddy was on the cover. Sorry, Smike. FNAF 3, Springtrap. This makes sense. While not the namesake of the series, he's the only real animatronic in said game, and is the main antagonist of it. It would be pretty weird if this game, all about Springtrap and his story and lore, had a picture of Phantom Freddy on the cover, right?
It would, particularly since Freddy is more of a mechanic in the game rather than an antagonist. He's not really present, he's easily ignored. It makes more sense to put Springtrap on the cover art instead.
That would take away from the importance of Springtrap in this game. Okay, so clearly Scott is not above using different characters for the box arts if said character is extremely prominent in the game. Good to know. FNAF 4, Nightmare Freddy. You could argue that Nightmare Fredbear would be more fitting here, but he's supposed to be a surprise in the game since his design was never fully revealed before the launch of FNAF 4. Using Nightmare Freddy here makes a lot of sense.
And Fredbear is only present in 1 or 2 nights where Freddy is present for most, if not all.
Okay, so now we're at sister location. You'd think that Circus Baby would be front and center here, right?
It could go either way, but no, I would expect Freddy again, because he gets a decent chunk of screen time. He's an active antagonist in the game, not just a mechanic. And as you mentioned earlier, he's a namesake of the series. He is the face of the franchise. And we've seen this kind of thing before, where Freddy is active in the game and on the cover art, but not really the main threat. However, Circus Baby is present, guides the player, and is the main antagonist. So a solution that I can see is to have 2 cover arts for the game. One with Freddy, the namesake and the face of the franchise, and one with Circus Baby, the antagonist of this story-driven game.
They guide you through the entire game. Their design isn't a secret, as it was shown extensively in teasers and the trailer alongside the literal intro and literal title screen of the game. Okay, so let's see it. What's the box art for a sister location? Funtime Freddy. Funtime Freddy! A character who is, yes, in the game, and yes, has a lot of screen time.
While I agree it's odd to not have Circus Baby on the cover art for those reasons, you answered it yourself already. You know why he's there. He's in the game, he has a lot of screen time, and he is the namesake in the series. He is the face of Five Nights at Freddy's.
But isn't that important overall to sister location, and is clearly taking the spotlight away from a much more obvious candidate?
He's taking the spotlight away from someone when he's the face of this series. I'd say the spotlight is right where it needs to be. But this again really isn't a problem because of something you're about to say.
Clearly, Click Team and Scott thought this was important as well, because guess who's on the box art of the console ports of sister location? That's right, motherfucking Circus Baby.
So, she is on the cover art for the game, therefore resolving your issue. And this is the exact thing I said before. 2 cover arts. One with Freddy, one with Circus Baby. This is a non-issue.
That being that Circus Baby is heavily underutilized in their own star game. This is the Circus Baby game. So tell me why the only render of her in any of the actual gameplay is her lifelessly sitting on a fucking conveyor belt in one of the worst sections of the entire game, which, trust me, we will get to later.
What's next is more horror, and we feel that horror genre is something really fun to explore because really it's the only genre in games that deal with emotion. I mean, in horror games you can sacrifice like gameplay enjoyment just to deliver an emotion. You can't do that in any other game genre, and it's really fun to explore that. So we're going to explore horror more, we're going to explore the survival horror formula more in the more game, and the next game is going to be more like survival horror inspired. Penumbra was sort of like, is it an adventure game? Is it like a survival horror? But the new game is going to be like pure survival horror. That's our goal with it.
What would you see as the key to manipulating the player into being horrified?
Well, the key into scaring the player is to allowing him to scare himself, because you can't really like scare the player with something really concrete. I mean, you can never come up with a monster unless the player like is scared of spiders or something that really terrify him. Instead, you have to like be subtle about it and make him believe that there's something that he's really afraid of, and that thing is going to happen to him anytime soon. That's when you can induce real fear into the player, and also immerse him in the game world. And she should have the feeling of being insecure and not really sure about what's going to happen next. That's the really best thing, I think. Is that we try and keep everything in the player's mind, show as little as possible, and also let the player do as little as possible. Because if you're like shooting stuff all the time, that's your main activity. You're not gonna focus on some weird sound. So if your entire focus is just focusing on weird sounds, you get a different kind of experience. You're really like minimizing the impressions that the player has. Sensory deprivation almost, with just the small sounds and ambient tunes and stuff like that. That's a big point. And also we have this interaction thing. It's interesting. I think someone, was it PC Format or UK, something like that? They call the game, like Anders has some headline like Desktop Simulator 2000. And that's basically our game. I mean, it's not fun to play in any way or other than like messing around with the physics. There's not like a shooter where you can just put some enemies in and then you have the game. We need to build environments and use this physical interaction to get anywhere. So that's a big of the gameplay. We don't have any like, this is the fun core, but we make like a holistic approach.
This is a concept and a trope in the horror genre that has been around for a very long time, and I would say really brought to light with Amnesia: The Dark Descent. You keep the main antagonists or the threats hidden from the player. You see the monster as little as possible. The game lets your mind do the work for it. And when you finally do see the monster, or in this case, Circus Baby, all you see is a lifeless, empty shell. And that feeds into the narrative, into what Circus Baby is trying to do. I'm going to keep repeating the fact that this is a story-driven game. You will see horror tropes like this displayed throughout the game, just like every other horror game that has a narrative.
Never jump scares the player once in the entire game, despite essentially being the main antagonist, and no, Enter does not count.
Enter does count when she's on the conveyor belt and she's guiding you through and you mess up. That's her. She is entered. That's how she's talking to you when she's in that deactivated state. She's already out of her shell. She is lying to you.
And she isn't even included in the obviously not canon custom night mode for literally no reason whatsoever. What is the point of ignoring her so much?
I agree with this. I don't know why she wouldn't be in the custom night when she was in the game. It is an odd decision.
If Scott wanted to create this character that never shows up and just guides the player around, That's fine, but there are so many sections in this game that would be visually enhanced by a sliver of Circus Baby physically being there. For example, when the lights go out in this one section and she starts talking to you, would it not have been sick as hell if her face lit up behind the glass in the darkness, FNAF 1 Freddy style?
Visually enhanced, I suppose, but that would be at the cost of atmosphere and tension, which are super important to develop in a horror game. Immersion to draw the player in. The point of this here is that she's talking to you. She knows you're there, but you don't know where she is. You have no idea if she's in the room with you or not. Fear of the unknown is a powerful thing. And I'm not the only one who understands that either. There's a quote from someone who some would consider to be the greatest writer in the horror genre. The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear. And the oldest and strongest kind of fear is the fear of the unknown.
I mean, they're still great films, just not latching onto the whole fear, terror thing for me. I thought about it for a while, and it's that whole fear of the unknown thing, which is a well-covered concept, but basically letting the mind do the work for you. In Darkness Falls, the enemy blends in with the darkness, her face reveals nothing about her. How she kills you is almost completely unknown, aside from seeing the resulting bodies. She's fast, she can float, and I remember plenty of the scenes that set up with her just breathing still chill the fuck out of me.
Now, as Mahler says in that clip, the creature is cloaked in black and blends in with the darkness really well, so you can't really make out what it looks like. So it's fine to show it like that. Circus Baby, on the other hand, her shell is white and red with orange on top. You could have her faded, but the colors wouldn't mesh too well together, and you can still see her. Whereas Ennard only has one very neutral color outside of the mask, gray, and it blends into the blue really well, so you can only kind of see it. By the way, if you have any interest in horror related to video games, I recommend watching Mahler's Amnesia vs. Soma series. He covers the general topic pretty thoroughly during his dissections of these two games. Anyway, I want to take a moment to talk about horror, because it's an important thing to discuss when talking about anything horror related. I know, crazy concept, huh? The very nature of horror is extremely subjective and a deeply personal thing. What might scare you might not scare me. For example, I still believe I have yet to be truly scared of something from a video game. You'll see me jump and get startled, but I don't think I've ever felt a real, deep-seated fear. So the way that I approach horror is through respect for how much work is put into it. Let me pose a question. What do you think would be more memorable to a player? A cheap jump scare with a loud noise and some scripted chase sequence, or being scared of a gust of wind or a small chair in an empty room? I appreciate the craft of psychological horror. The game really getting into the player's mind and make them scared of nothing. This is why I hold Amnesia: The Dark Descent as one of the best in the horror genre, even though it has its fair share of flaws. And also why I appreciate Soma, even though it doesn't exactly work for me. To quote someone off of Reddit, because they phrased it perfectly, if I'm looking for something scary, I look for something that makes me uncomfortable. Something that's just wrong enough that I can't quite put my finger on exactly what it is. Something that gives just enough information that you know something is very, very wrong and utterly inescapable. And maybe that's why I don't think FNAF is good. When I played the first night of FNAF 1 for the very first time, I did feel something was there. It helps that I don't like mannequins in horror games, or the idea of something that shouldn't move is moving around. Freaky stuff, man. But anyway, when I first played it, I felt something was there. But like I said before, that quickly disappeared. I'll talk about my personal experiences with FNAF and my thoughts on video that I have in mind for the game series. But for now, since we're back on topic with FNAF, let's continue.
Why the hell doesn't she jump scare the player here for messing up the code instead of maskless Ennard doing it?
Because she is Ennard.
Don't use the, oh, she's still trying to trick the player at this point in the game, she wouldn't hurt you, oh, Circus Baby would never hurt you excuse.
Is that a thing that people say about that? Why? Why would anyone say that? She's literally talking to you about why she's going to kill you as she's about to kill you.
I will not take story reasons as an excuse for lackluster gameplay or missed potential, since the story literally could have just been tweaked to include these extremely weird omissions. Here, I'll tweak the story right now to make this baby section better. Have it so messing up the passcode canonically puts baby into some kind of attack mode, and she jump scares the player out of her own control. Boom! I just made this section slightly cooler, and the story is literally the exact same, just with one new detail added that never has to be brought up ever again.
I can understand the perspective of not accepting gameplay being sacrificed for story, and I agree with that, because it's a criticism that I've had for a lot of other horror games. However, I agree with it to the point where it makes sense. For this sequence, he won't accept story reasons for sacrificed gameplay, but there are parts where it is appropriate so the game can tell its story, because, you know, story-driven game. Here, Circus Baby is already out of the shell, and is Ennard, an amalgamation of Baby, Ballora, Foxy, and Freddy. She is pretending to be deactivated, but still able to talk to Michael to guide him to the scooping room so she can scoop him and walk freely outside, disguised as a human. And narratively, this is fine. The pretending bit isn't something we're unaware of. She tells us straight up that she learned how to get really good at pretending. It's the nature of how the game is. It's telling a story. And in a horror game, it needs to be believable, and it needs to make sense. We know what Circus Baby's goal is. Get Michael to the scooping room to wear him as a suit. The controls for the scoop are presumably outside of the glass, where you see Ennard standing. So she needs to be outside of the room, and she needs to guide Michael to the room. When you see her suit on the conveyor belt, she says she's being prepared for the scooping room, and that the belt will take her there. With that in mind, if we go with his altered suggestion, Circus Baby would have to be in the shell for her shell to spring to life and attack you from the belt. That would mean when you do it right and send her away, she would go to the scooping room, so she would not be able to guide Michael. Whatever she said about that chip thing that she has you get from her, I'm fairly confident that's bullshit and she's just following you and talking to you. The chip will do nothing. So with that in mind, how would his suggestion work for the rest of the story to function?
What really stings, though, is that Circus Baby did eventually get a jump scare in a Scott FNAF game when UCN came out. But if you know anything about that game, you'd probably know that pretty much every single jump scare sucks complete ass.
They suck in the rest of the games too. Look, jump scares in general are just really cheap ways to quote-unquote scare players. And if the player isn't affected by jump scares whatsoever, then they completely fail in this franchise. If you want a jump scare to really work, you need it placed in a spot where the player is immersed, the atmosphere is tense, the player's stress is heightened, then at the right moment and where it makes sense to happen, the jump scare happens when the player doesn't expect it. But that's in the best case scenario. In this franchise, players provenly get desensitized to the jump scares very quickly. Jump scares in general just aren't good. They're cheap, they're easy, and depending on the person, they just flat out do not work.
The jump scares in Base Sister Location are genuinely some of the best in the entire series.
Genuine question. How and why?
The idea of the animatronics having faceplates that open up to reveal creepy-looking endoskeletons is incredibly creative, and easily one of the best things about the entire game.
Well, creative, sure, it's an idea. Does it make the jump scare better? I don't think so. Horror is extremely subjective. I acknowledge that. But these just look ridiculous to me. I don't know what to tell you.
It's like, look at that. What's fucking scary about this?
It's just a mask that opened up on some wires that happened to go around in all the facial shapes. It's nothing. There's nothing with substance there.
That's a noise. Yeah.
Not with the introduction segment yet. Can I talk about the entire game from start to finish now? No. Story? What do you mean I have to complain about the story? When have I ever talked about story in depth in a FNAF game before? If only I knew someone who actually cared about the FNAF story in the slightest, who could complain about the story for me while I sit back and eat Sister Location brand popcorn.
And this would probably be the part where he and I would disagree the most. For me, the story was the only thing that was interesting about the FNAF games in the first place. Like I said, the games themselves would be kinda interesting for the first few minutes, but since I was still new, I kept dying. A lot. Which stopped it from being scary and turned it into frustrating. The story was all I was interested in because there was nothing else to these games. Now, the games are easy to the point where I don't have to think about what to do in order to beat them. The jump scares do nothing if I even die at all. The RNG is predictable and there's nothing else for me to do. So once again, the underlying story is the only thing that can potentially keep my interest in the franchise. So the story would be the biggest focus for me, particularly for this game. Anyway, no offense to Postrespect, but I'm not here for him. I'm here for this guy.
Sister Location is probably the best YouTuber game out of the entire series. I say probably because it's hard to beat FNAF 1 in that regard, but just looking at it from a basic level, it has a lot more moving parts to keep the viewer engaged. The gameplay changes each and every night, so the viewer doesn't have to keep watching the same loop over and over again. It is very, very story heavy, so you can watch it almost like a movie. And watching a YouTuber play it, you get to see their reactions to all the scripted events for the first time.
I agree. Really, nothing else for me to say here. I agree with that completely.
I fully understand that a large portion of the fan base has never actually played any of the FNAF games, and even a smaller portion has probably ever even played Sister Location. So, just as a guess, I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of the people who love this game have never actually played it, and have just watched someone else play it.
And that's so weird to me. Like, not to be rude, but how can you say you're a fan of a game series if you've never played them? It's one thing to watch people play the game, it's another thing entirely to play it yourself. That'd be like if I said I was a fan of the Avengers, but I haven't watched any of the Marvel movies or read any of the comics. I just watched someone else watch them. I think I really, truly discovered this concept when a channel called IGP played a game called House on the Hill, made 2 videos on it. It was a horror game, and the amount of times he got scared and sounded tense and all that, well, I was interested immediately, wanted to play it myself, and then I did. And it was easily one of the most schizophrenic games I ever played. And much like Sister Location, it is extremely on rails. Actually, I'd say it's worse than Sister Location because there aren't even mini-games. When I played it, I expected my experience to at least be a little bit different from the content creators, but as far as the gameplay was concerned, it wasn't. What was different was that I wasn't scared by it in any way, shape, or form. That's why I say if you're gonna call yourself a fan of a game or a game series, you might want to actually play the games first.
But coming from the perspective of someone who has very little nostalgia for this game, has played it multiple times over, and has spent literal hours and hours thinking about it and talking to people about it for this video, I have to say, the more you think about it all, the more cracks begin to appear in the foundation of this game. The more stupid design choices start to rear their ugly head. the more insane parts of this game begin to look even more insane than they did before.
And I agree, but that's the case for all of the games before and after this one. There are cracks in this game just like there were cracks in FNAF 1, 2, 3, 4, all of them. Some of them narrative, be that overarching or specific to that game. Some of them mechanical and how the controls and gameplay work. They all have their problems. It's not just this game, and it's not because this game is story driven.
The game starts off inside an elevator that's slowly going down to a facility that keeps animatronics stored away until they are rented out for parties or shows. This concept is actually really cool, and is a nice change of pace compared to the other games in the series. The environment in Sister Location look amazing. That's something I have to give the game right off the bat, because almost every single area looks at least good. While the more high-tech sci-fi aesthetic may be a downside to some, it's genuinely one of the only positives to me. Almost every room render looks great, with a few exceptions.
Right, let me just stop him right here, because something needs to be clarified. This is not a room render. At least not one in the sense that most people would be familiar with. So I would refrain from calling it that. This is mostly a PNG with some animated spots with a fisheye effect to make it seem like it's an actual room. And you can really see the limitations of that effect when you send Circus Baby away. There's a reason why Ballora Gallery and Funtime Auditorium are shrouded in darkness outside of the narrative reasons. Because darkness hides the limitations of the space that you're in, and the movement, or should I say lack of movement, that you're taking. It's an illusion that I think is fairly well executed, and I agree the art looks sharp, but this is not a room render.
Here we're introduced to Hand Unit, who is essentially the phone guy of this game. This is probably a hot take, but I really dislike Hand Unit. The writing for the character often leans too much into humor.
Just like horror, comedy is subjective. Not everyone finds the same things funny, and it's fine to not like it if you don't find it funny. But I don't know, I thought the Hand Unit was fine, I thought the comedic timing was fine, and the absurdity of what it auto-selects for you, I thought it was funny. It was funny to me.
The character often leans too much into humor, which is fine in concept, but in execution it takes a lot away from the overall experience.
In horror, it's important to have moments of levity to sort of reset the players so as to not burn them out from an overload of scary. A reprieve from the scares, if you will. This game has multiple instances of this, the Hand Unit and the TV program at the end of the night. You see this concept in Amnesia: The Dark Descent.
This is the second hub level of the game, and is supposed to give some contrast to the stressful lurker encounter. We think building up contrast like this is extremely important for the horror mood. Only by seeing a bright level can you appreciate the dark one, and so on. If you do not do this, player will get used to the stuff and the effect will lessen greatly.
Humor is a subjective aspect of any piece of media, so it's hard to definitively say that the game isn't funny. But at least to me, I didn't laugh out loud once, and I often felt taken out of the experience when Hand Unit made the same shitty "lol, I messed up your keypad input" joke each night.
He is correct about the humor, and it is perfectly fine if he did not find Hand Unit funny. I did, but to each their own.
The cash basket.
I see what you were trying to type, and I will autocorrect it for you. Thank you for selecting exotic.
Let's go!
I'm not a heartless, humorless bastard. I thought that was funny.
Exotic.
Let's go! You're probably wondering why I'm even bringing this up. Well,
let's go!
Looking back at the previous FNAF games, a lot of them also had subtle jokes and humor, but they almost never took away from the experience and instead added to them in ways that felt very grounded.
And I agree with that, but again, humor is subjective, and I didn't think the humor in Sister Location detracted from the experience. After this, he talks about the humor in the other games and what he thought was funny. I don't want to beat a dead horse, so let's move on.
Nothing really happens on the first night of Sister Location, which is fair for a couple reasons. First of all, this is a completely new style of gameplay compared to the other games in the series, so making the first night have no real stakes allows the player to get used to everything. Another thing, FNAF 3 also did the same thing, where the first night has no real threat and is just for world building. So hey, whatever, that's fine.
Agreed. Night 1 exists to set the tone and the pace of this game. You get a decent understanding of what this game is by having it immediately show you that it's not like the others that you would have played up to this point.
Every night in this game, I'm going to tally how much gameplay is accomplished. The gameplay in Sister Location is split up into 4 varieties. First, we have the button-clicking gameplay. This is the mind-numbing, boring stuff you have to do almost every night of the game. Clicking on the buttons for the animatronics, going through vents, yada yada. The next gameplay style is the story-focused minigames. These are minigames that barely count as games and are more just for story reasons. They barely have any actual gameplay to them, and are the worst offenders on repeat playthroughs. Next up, we have the semi-story-focused minigames. These include minigames that are typically about going from point A to point B, while not getting caught. They're there to flow the story together, but they also feature actual gameplay. Finally, we have the actual minigames. These are actual minigames with full mechanics that could be separated from the story and still work on their own. These are typically the most fun parts of the entire game.
Hang on, let me do a little something here.
First, we have the button-clicking gameplay. This is the mind-numbing, boring stuff you have to do almost every night of the game. The next gameplay style is the story-focused minigames. These are minigames that barely count as games and are more just for story reasons. They barely have any actual gameplay to them, and are the worst offenders on repeat playthroughs.
Alright, I had my fun. He doesn't say anything I disagree with in the rest of this segment, so we'll just skip to night 2.
Jokes aside, I actually do think an angsty teen, maybe dialed back a bit, would have been a better companion for this game. Story-wise, I guess it wouldn't make that much sense, but like I established earlier, you can always tweak a story to make things work, so that's not much of an excuse.
There's a difference between can and should.
The first gameplay segment of the night is about you protecting yourself from the biddy-babs under a desk, using a piece of metal to protect yourself. Here's an example of the cylinder warping looking really ugly. In fact, a lot of things here make no sense. Why are the holes in this piece of metal so perfectly smooth? Scott loves to model things with this Minecraft pixel art looking ass withering all the time. So the one time that would have actually worked, he opts to make this worn down piece of metal look more like a gray block of cheese. This is a story-based minigame, and actually isn't much of a game at all. Baby tells you to hide under here to protect yourself after hand unit shuts down, but all you actually have to do is click down and move your mouse to stop the biddy-babs from moving the metal away from you. It's a pretty nothing section, and it's over before it even feels like it starts. For the first actual gameplay section of Sister Location, not a great first impression.
I agree. It doesn't feel like there's much danger to the player. You're not doing much. The part of this that got people when the game first released is that they didn't read what the box said, so they would click the square and try to physically drag the door, which is not how it works. You click the box and you follow the door. Once you realize that, it's a pretty nothing section. Doesn't make sense narratively either. You're fighting against the biddy-babs here, who look like they should be tiny. How the hell a grown-ass man would have this much trouble in this situation? I don't know.
Which is the first minigame in Sister Location that has some actual gameplay behind it. The controls from the vent section are carried over here, as you need to crawl from one side of a room to the other. The room is pitch black, except for a door that has lights above it at the end of the room. If you hear Ballora's music get too loud, stop in place and wait for it to die down. While no music is playing, you can sprint for the door. Extremely simple game that is an alright challenge. Here's my biggest issue with it, however. It's super simple when it really shouldn't be. What I'm talking about is this scripted section of the minigame where Ballora spins across the screen to the other side. When this happens, you have to stop and wait for her to leave. This is a cool section until you realize the way it's scripted makes it happen at the exact same point every single time you play it. This is just insanely missed potential.
So the argument is that this section is bad because the event is scripted. I agree that this section is simple, really simple. Probably simpler than it needs to be. There are playthroughs where you will probably never see Ballora until that scripted event, which tells me that there is something about Ballora that Scott wanted to make sure we saw or paid attention to. Because it's not like this section will scare you. You know where she is when she's coming around. You can hear her. I'll come back to this, but I want to talk about the scripted thing first. I will pose to you that scripted events in FNAF were a thing before Sister Location, and I have evidence to support that. I swear with every fiber in my being that there is a scripted encounter in FNAF 2 Night 6. How do I know this? 8 years ago, I played FNAF 2 on a livestream because I could not beat Night 6. I would die over and over and over again, and every now and then, I would die to Toy Bonnie, and it stuck out to me as incredibly odd. Let me explain. Ordinarily, I would pull up the live stream from Twitch, but I can't do that anymore. Thanks, Twitch. This is on YouTube. Don't watch it. Anyway, you'll notice right away, I never look at the right vent until a certain amount of time has passed. Why? Because up to that point, my only danger in that vent is Mangle, and they give an audio cue when they're at the vent. Even though Toy Bonnie is active in the night, he just doesn't show up in that vent until later on. And even then, it's not that often. Here are the difficulty levels for the animatronics on night 6. You see Toy Chica, Bonnie, and Freddy all have the same levels. Throughout the night, I would see Toy Chica a lot more than the other two, and Freddy more than Bonnie. I truly believe that Bonnie appearing in the right vent on night 6 is potentially scripted, because I swear I should have seen him more. If this is a tinfoil hat moment for me, I'll take the L, but fucking Bonnie, man. But anyway, back to Ballora. This section serves another purpose, and it's also the reason for why this scripted event even happens. It's showing you that when Ballora moves, a song plays. All the time. So later, when Circus Baby is guiding you and she says this...
Stop. She is right in front of you. Don't move.
You know it's a lie. Because there's no song.
Too many things in this game are scripted segments when they should have 100% been actual gameplay mechanics.
I am beating a dead horse here, and I am going to stop addressing this argument after this. But while I agree that Sister Location needs more gameplay and more engaging gameplay in some sections, I do not agree that there are too many scripted events in this game. You have 3. You have the soundbite and event, Ballora spinning in front of you, and Foxy jumping out at you, and that's it. Scripted events happen in story-driven games, which this is. This game's problem is not that it has scripted events. The problem specifically with them is that they're poorly executed.
Ballora spinning across the screen should not be a scripted element, it should be an actual mechanic in the minigame. Have it so you have to listen to her music to make sure it's not too loud, but also have to watch out in case Ballora spins in front of you. That adds both an audio and visual aspect to the minigame. It just hurts me every single time I play the Ballora minigame and get to the part where she spins, and every single time you have to sit there and wait for her to leave at the exact same spot when that idea would have been perfect as an addition to the actual minigame mechanics.
I agree. It would have done what the scripted event does and given you more encounters, so it seems like Ballora is actually active in her own area. Makes sense to me. I would pose to you that this game isn't really meant to be played multiple times, 2 max, but other than that, I agree.
This isn't like a thing where when you're done either. Even if you complete this minigame and get to the next one, if you die there, you're sent all the way back to Ballora Gallery. So this isn't even a thing where it just makes repeat playthroughs less interesting, it also makes repeat attempts on a single playthrough less interesting.
On that, I definitely agree, and it's something that I criticize other games for as well. Games being hard and or unfair with the progression system, so where the checkpoints are, how far back you have to go if you die, very quickly lose the tension and atmosphere and everything else horror games need to keep you invested and in a state to get spooked.
I would have much preferred more fleshed out minigames with proper checkpoints after each one rather than what we got, being a bunch of half-baked minigames that you need to complete in a row without dying, or else you're sent all the way back to the last insanely brutal checkpoint. This is where scripted events like this in a game where you're probably going to be retrying things a lot becomes a very apparent issue. Things like this during minigames makes them lose their punch fast, when actual additional mechanics would work significantly better for repeat tries and just overall in general.
Yes. Story-driven games need to have more forgiving checkpoints so the player isn't as quickly frustrated if they're struggling in a section. Scott. And he is absolutely right. Scripted events being placed in an unfair checkpoint system so the player has to sit through them every time that they have to retry is a dick move. If you're going to have scripted events in your horror game, move the checkpoint behind that event. Scott.
After crawling through the gallery, you're greeted with one of the best minigames in Sister Location, that being the Funtime Freddy Breaker Room minigame. You're given a monitor that you flip up FNAF camera style, that features a bunch of systems that need to be restarted. Each system has a load time to restart them, that starts at 0% until it's completed at 100%. You have to hold down each system to make them reach 100%. However, Funtime Freddy is active in the same room as you. He'll make attempts to get close to you while you're restarting each of the systems. So every once in a while, you need to put down the monitor and play an audio cue to trick him into going back to the starting point. Restart each and every system to finish the minigame. In concept, I like this minigame a lot. It has a very classic FNAF feel to it, since you have to balance an office section and a camera section to survive the night. However, as cool as it is, I think it might be too simple. The audio cues can kind of just be spammed whenever you can use them, so there really isn't any skill on that front. It kind of just boils down to increase system to 50%, close monitor, spam audio until it's safe, go back to the monitor, rinse, repeat. I think a pretty simple change here would be to have two.
In contrast, I didn't find this part all that interesting. I felt it was more of a time waster and just got confused. Like, why is Freddy in here? Why does he have such an issue with us restoring the power? You'd think he'd want that. I have questions that aren't being answered. But anyway, I get that you like it because it's similar to classic FNAF, and then you criticize it for being too simple, and that it doesn't take much skill to do. But that's the case with classic FNAF. You don't have to be in the cameras except to make Foxy chill out, which takes half a second, and the rest of the time you just listen. Check the lights every now and then. Very simple. And just like with this minigame, once you figure out how it works, it becomes almost boringly simple.
I should also say that visually, this part of the game looks fantastic. All the different Funtime Freddy renders look great, and the area itself has a lot of detail.
Alright, minor editing nitpick here. While you're praising this part of the game for looking good and having a lot of detail and saying Freddy's model looks good, you mostly show a black screen where nobody can see a single blessed thing. I would have suggested maybe grabbing some stills of the character model to show, and then a non-blacked out screen of the background to show what you were talking about, because otherwise it looks like you're basing that off of those brief half-second flashes of light where you can't see anything well enough to tell if it has good detail or not. But like I said, nitpick.
Once again, in my ideal Sister Location world, each minigame is more interesting and fleshed out, but has a checkpoint at the end of them to make up for the more complex mechanics. The way the game is currently set up, sure, having to redo multiple minigames if you die does add a lot of stress and tension to the game, however, it's in a very artificial way that makes it kind of feel unfair. This isn't, oh, I'm so scared, I gotta get through this scary section again, I'm so tense. This is, oh, I'm so annoyed, I gotta watch Ballora spin around in front of me for the 14th time.
This illustrates an issue that's present among several games in the horror genre, something that I mentioned before. The balance between horror and the feeling of being tense and stressed out, and the gameplay difficulty and progression. Do you want the player to be stressed to the absolute limit to make the scares hit harder? Yes. Should you achieve that by having a bullshit checkpoint system so if they die, they have to sit through something they can't skip over and make them waste their time? No. But again, this isn't something unique to Sister Location. This isn't, oh, I'm so scared, I have to do this scary night again, I'm so tense. This is, I'm so annoyed, I can't reach through this monitor and shove that balloon sign right down his...
Right? Night 3, baby! It starts off the same way the previous nights do, with you clicking on a bunch of buttons, seeing weird stuff happen, until you're given a task for the night by hand unit. Night 3 has you going through Funtime Auditorium to get to parts and service, to do a routine checkup on Funtime Freddy. Having Funtime Freddy be the end goal of the night again is a little weird, but it's not really that big of a deal, just kinda odd. This night does something a little different, however. When you're finally able to progress to Funtime Auditorium, you're given a split pathway. You can either listen to Hand Unit and do the task at hand, or disobey him and go forward to Circus Gallery. On paper, this is a great idea. This entire location is set up in a way where you'd think you'd be given a lot more options on where to go, and this appears to finally be utilizing that. However, all going this way does is give you an exclusive bit of Circus Baby dialogue that's important for something else later in the game. Nothing changes if you go to this room, and after you finish up here, you just continue the night like nothing happened. The real kicker, not counting entirely different endings, this is the only optional path in the entire game. You're never allowed to explore the location for secrets or take alternate paths that lead to different endings. The entire game is pretty much on rails. It's really disappointing too, because having the game set up in a more task-based way could really fix a lot of its issues. Imagine that instead of a set path for each night, you have a time limit of let's say 15 minutes and a series of tasks to do during the night. You can do these tasks in any order, as long as you finish them all within said time limit. That way, you can explore the entire map in any way you please, and everyone's playthroughs could be a little different. I think that would really sell the whole being a handyman thing a lot better.
I agree with the game being on rails and lacking any option to explore for secrets, and that being a lack of potential, because it is. You can have story-driven games that allow for exploration and utilize environmental storytelling to make up for the fact that you are going off the beaten path, often rewarding you with a deeper insight to the story being told, extra details that may be unnerving, etc., and items for later in the game. What I disagree with is what you're proposing, because the goal of the game is to tell a definitive story. The story of Michael going down there and Elizabeth killing him to escape. While sure, your suggestion would sell the service technician part of the gameplay, how would you merge the task-based gameplay with the story? I think if Scott wants to tell this story, then the story should remain able to be told. I worded that horribly, but I hope people understand what I mean.
Anyway, all I'm really saying here is that I wish there was more exploration in this game, and I wish there was more alternate pathways that actually led to more interesting things.
Perfectly fine to want that, and I agree.
You're able to go through the Funtime Auditorium. This minigame is pretty similar to the Ballora Gallery one, but instead of being based on audio, it's based on knowing your surroundings. Your goal here is to get from one end of the room to the other, just like Ballora Gallery, except this time you're provided with a flash beacon that creates a small flash of light in the room for you to check your surroundings. Occasionally when you flash your beacon, Funtime Foxy will be standing there. When this happens, you just have to wait in place and flash the light again to make sure they're gone. I know people often have trouble with this one, it's not explained super well in game, but the best way to do it is to listen to the quiet noise that plays after you flash the beacon. A good rule of thumb here is to crawl while the noise is still playing and stop when the noise stops. At that point, flash the light again to check, rinse and repeat until you make it to parts and service. This minigame is fine.
Funny enough, I just learned of a better strategy that completely breaks this part of the game and makes it slightly less annoying to get through.
For the game to actually spawn Funtime Foxy, one of two things need to happen. Either we use our flash beacon, which obviously engages Funtime Foxy, or we hold down our W key and start moving. The flash beacon part isn't important because I never use the flash beacon because I can't see, but what is important is the moving. For the game to register us as moving, our W key needs to be held down for more than a few frames, but what if we don't do this? If we spam our W key to move and ensure that we're only holding it down for a couple frames, Funtime Foxy doesn't spawn. Yeah, that's right. If we spam our W key instead of holding it down, the game doesn't think we've moved yet, so Funtime Foxy will never spawn, and we have a free walk all the way to the end of Funtime Auditorium.
Do with that what you will. Ultimately, I don't have much on what he says for Night 3. The gameplay is pretty weak. But I will say that I acknowledge that this line is a joke.
Either you completely struggle to figure out how to bait Bon Bon to come out, or you know the surefire strategy to hit his button every single time. In that case, this entire section is literally just clicking buttons.
But that's all of what FNAF 1, 2, and 3 is.
In FNAF 1, if you're not flipping around in the cameras, which is done by clicking buttons, you're clicking buttons to turn on lights and shut the door. FNAF 2, we actually get a little crazier by having essentially the same thing, but no doors, and instead of clicking a button for the light in the hallway and the cameras, you press Control. So you use a meta button. FNAF 3, not lights, but know what's on the maintenance panel? Buttons. FNAF 4 is actually the one that manages to break away from the button mashing. If we're gonna make fun of Sister Location for having a section that's just clicking buttons, it's only fair to make fun of the other games that have that as the only thing you can do throughout the game.
All into perspective, this game features a minigame where you do nothing but click on a metal slab, 2 minigames where you crawl through long hallways and wait a lot, a minigame that makes everyone who plays it want to tear their own teeth out, and trust me, we will get to it shortly, one that has a surefire way to beat it every time and barely counts as an actual minigame, and one single minigame that I would consider very good. Do you see why I dislike this game?
So, as I said before, I do not disagree with you on the fact that this game is bad. It is devoid of gameplay. Its story has issues. It has horror elements but executes them horribly, and its pacing is trash. But I am also not going to pretend that the other games are any better. I touched on the jump scare elements, the controls, the difficulties. The classic games have boring, repetitive gameplay, controls that will work against you, story that has so many contrivances that it doesn't know which way is up, and scares that don't work once you're used to them. These are horror games. There is absolutely zero fear, suspense, stress, tension, nothing! Once you play these games more than once, and you know what you're doing, and what will happen, the illusion is gone. The same goes for Sister Location. The only difference is that Sister Location makes it 10 times more obvious.
It's not the amount of content that's the issue, it's what you're doing with said content that really matters.
And my argument for you is to stop and consider what you're doing with the content in the previous games. You were doing the exact same thing over and over and over again. There is nothing else to it. There's nothing different that happens, nothing exciting, nothing you can't expect, nothing to make the content feel fresh. In fact, the only praise I can give Sister Location is that it at least tried to do something new. But I have a feeling this is probably where we'll disagree the most. You think only Sister Location has issues. I think the whole series is bad.
What you're really left with here when you strip all the minigames away is an interactive visual novel, which is fine if you're into that, but personally, that's not why I play Five Nights at Freddy's games. And that's also not what I expect when I'm playing a Five Nights at Freddy's game.
Then explain why you play Five Nights at Freddy's games. You don't care about the story, so all that's left is mechanics, which are repetitive to the point of being predictable and able to do with your eyes closed. It's fine to not expect this game. No one did. It broke the mold, and I already said why so many times people want me to stop saying it.
Love them or hate them, most of the original 4 games have extremely solid mechanics that can hook a player early and keep them going for all 5 nights.
Alright, let me pose this to you. You said Night 2's minigame was the best one, right? So what if Sister Location was just 5 nights of just that minigame, but it just got harder with each night? Would that make it better? Doing the same thing over and over again? If your answer isn't immediately yes, I want you to take a good long time to think about what it is about the first 4 FNAF games that you like so much, and why. Let me explain why I'm harping on this so much, and hopefully you'll see why I'm so confused by this. There's a very little known, extremely small title that's been floating around from a developer that no one's heard of. It's called The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword. Now this tiny indie game almost got ratioed out of existence and was famously criticized and easily considered one of the worst Zelda games in the franchise. Out of the many reasons for this, one of them is because of how repetitive it was. You would explore and clear the exact same areas and dungeons 3 times each. They were just a little bit harder. You would fight one boss 3 times, fight the same enemies in the same 3 areas, you would fight another boss 3 different times. The only difference is that it would just get a little bit harder. So of course when I heard about this, it kind of hit me like, oh, the gamers really don't appreciate doing the same thing over and over, and you know, kind of makes sense. And then we come to this franchise, and for 4 games in a row, that's literally all you do. The same thing. It's just harder each time. So why is it different here?
I do indeed understand that making a super fair and balanced difficulty curve for a game like this would be a challenge. But oh my god, did Night 4 just drop the ball completely. The intention here was definitely to make this night tough as nails, but Jesus, nothing could have truly prepared the player for this. The night picks up right after the events of Night 3. Since Michael Afton got jump-scared by Funtime Foxy instead of properly finishing his shift, he finds himself trapped in a spring-lock suit in a dark room. Baby's dialogue kind of gets aggressive here, which is an odd tonal shift when you consider that only one night after this, Baby is once again playing nice and trying to help you. This being her mask-off moment could have worked, but it really goes nowhere and feels out of place to happen here. Baby blabbers on a bit, Ballora fucking dies, and finally the night truly begins.
Everything that he says about Night 4, I 100% agree with. There's a lot that can be said about Night 4, story-wise, mechanic-wise, gameplay-wise. It is a very strange tonal shift from what we're dealing with up to this point. And it was such a strange choice of a night. Why is this here?
But now I ask you, what's worse? A night with one minigame that's insanely hard for some reason, or a night with pretty much zero content? One quick elevator ride and a haha funny exotic butters joke later, and we finally made it to the last night of Sister Location. This night tasks you with going back through Funtime Auditorium to reach parts and service again. However, on your way through the auditorium, there's nothing that can actually jump scare you. That's right, here you're able to run through the room without actually doing a minigame. Here's my issue with that though. Yes, I understand why there's nothing here anymore from a story standpoint. All the animatronics are currently a pile of spaghetti holding a clown mask. But would this not have been the perfect moment in the game to finally reach back to some of those FNAF core gameplay roots? Here's what I mean. On Night 2, you go through Ballora Gallery. On Night 3, you have to go through Funtime Auditorium. Both of these sections involve crawling through a dark room and trying to reach the other side. So, wouldn't it have been really cool if now on Night 5, both of these mechanics were combined to serve as one final challenge that you would actually have practiced for already thanks to the previous crawling minigames. Just like in previous FNAF games, where each night things are added and difficulty is raised, this would serve as a perfect point in Sister Location to draw inspiration from those older titles to make an engaging and fun part of the game. It's literally the final night. Wouldn't a final, harder crawling challenge that tests your knowledge be literally perfect here?
I'm not going to say it would be really cool because of how I view the other games, but yes, a tie back to use skills you learned previously would be the next logical step to take for the gameplay. But what would the antagonist be in this room? As you said, all of the animatronics are now entered, and that's waiting for you in the service room. If you want Ennard to be in this room for this section, what would the challenge be? How would the two skills combine? Why would Ennard be waiting in this room if the goal is to guide Michael to the scooping room? Since this is a narrative game, you have to think about these things being here in a narrative sense. Does it make sense for this to be there? Why would this be there? Would this work for Circus Baby's plan? I know you don't seem to care about the story, but I do.
Oh, you're probably wondering, how do you unlock this secret ending? Okay, so occasionally when you game over in Sister Location, instead of the normal game over screen, you're met with a pixelated minigame where you play a circus baby and give cupcakes to children. You're given a pretty strict time limit here, and have to feed the kids the cupcakes in a certain order to feed them all. Once every kid is fed, an ice cream cone will be waiting at the end of the map. You have to take this ice cream cone all the way back to the start of the map to truly beat the minigame. On paper, the idea is okay. In execution, this sucks. This sucks so bad. Let me explain. This minigame is hard as hell to master if you're going into the game blind. You need to do a lot of specific things to complete it. And the only real hint you have is that extra bit of baby dialogue from earlier in the game. Once you figure out how to do it all, it becomes second nature. But learning how to do this whole thing perfectly can take a while. Clearly, Scott understood this. Having the player need a random chance game over minigame for an opportunity to try and beat the minigame is kind of an insane task. His solution to this? Have a secret 8-bit baby hidden away on the extras menu that lets you play the minigame as many times as you want. This then brings up the question, what in the world was the point of this being a death minigame at all? Any sane person would never do this during the main story playing for the first time.
Well, the point of the minigame being a chance death screen is so players know it exists. If they don't know it exists, do you think they'll go randomly poking around the extras menu looking for a hidden baby icon for the possibility of a secret ending that may or may not exist? Or will they just accept the base ending as the only ending in the game? You decide.
A lot of the rooms have button and number pads that you can even interact with. So why isn't the secret ending this crazy puzzle, where on night 5, you need to explore the whole location for clues and pieces of the puzzle so you can input some special code that then unlocks the baby minigame for you to play. That way, not only would the environments actually be put to good use, but the 8-bit minigame would feel way less disconnected from the rest of the game than it currently does.
On that, I agree. And from here, there isn't anything else that I disagree with. On this video, there's a small portion that I want to talk about on this follow-up video.
Take a look at FNAF 1 again as an example. In that game, Bonnie and Chica have AI that determines where in the pizzeria they will go. One of the coolest aspects about this AI, however, is that it isn't linear in the slightest. Bonnie and Chica are able to go back and forth between certain rooms, and when they get stopped by a door, they aren't just sent all the way back to square one. They often only get pushed back a couple rooms, and will be able to get back to the door faster because of that. The level of unpredictability Bonnie and Chica have in FNAF 1 makes them some of the most interesting characters in FNAF when it comes down to simply just how they move around. Their complexity then complements the simplicity of Freddy and Foxy's mechanics. Foxy has his stages at Pirate Cove that can be stalled by using the cameras, but the stages always come out in a linear order. And Freddy moves in a straight path towards the office until he gets to the last 2 cameras, where he'll linger around back and forth, looking for an opening to sneak inside. Neither of these characters have AI as interesting as Bonnie and Chica, but they work because they act as good side tasks you have to keep track of while dealing with the more prominent threats. Hell, even FNAF 4 has a sick AI system that goes completely unnoticed unless you have the map cheat on.
The 4 animatronics, Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy, move towards their office in specific paths. Bonnie goes on the left side, Freddy and Chica go on the right side, and Foxy is kind of specific. To start off the night, every single animatronic gets a certain difficulty number. This is the same system that gets used during the custom night mode. For every night, I'm going to be showing the animatronic's difficulty during the intro cards. So you probably know this already, but the max difficulty an animatronic can have is 20. Throughout the night, there's certain times where an animatronic gets the chance to move, and this is where your difficulty number comes in. Basically, whenever there's a chance for an animatronic to move, the game will randomly generate a number between 1 and 20. The game then compares your randomly generated number to your difficulty number. If your difficulty number is greater than or equal to the randomly generated number, then the animatronic will move. This is what makes the 420 difficulty so hard, because every single time there's a chance for an animatronic to move, your number will always be greater than or equal to 20 because the max setting is 20. For example, during night 2, Bonnie's difficulty is set to 3, which means that every single time there's a chance for him to move, a random number gets generated, and if that number is something like the number 2, 3 is greater than the number 2, which means he's gonna move. But if the number is something like 17, 3 is not greater than 17, which means he's gonna stay where he is. This system kinda only works for Bonnie and Chica. Freddy and Foxy work a little bit differently, but I'm gonna talk about those in a bit. If Bonnie gets blocked by the door, unlike Chica, he won't go back into the hallway, he'll go directly to the dining area every time.
I even did this myself just to confirm. I have to stop him and clear up a misconception. These games do not have AI, especially not the first 4. I get that saying AI is an easy way to describe enemy behavior in video games, but now that artificial intelligence is becoming more common and prominent, it's important to understand what AI is. In essence, for something to be considered AI, like an enemy in a video game, it would have to be a script designed to learn from the player and adapt to them. For something to be an AI, it would have to be able to learn. I read an article on techtarget.com talking about what is an AI. If you're interested in the topic, there'll be a link. But in the article, they described 4 skills that an AI focuses on. AI programming focuses on cognitive skills that include the following: Learning. This aspect of AI programming focuses on acquiring data and creating rules for how to turn it into actionable information. The rules, which are called algorithms, provide computing devices with step-by-step instructions for how to complete a specific task. Reasoning. This aspect of AI programming focuses on choosing the right algorithm to reach a desired outcome. Self-correction. This aspect of AI programming is designed to continually fine-tune algorithms and ensure they provide the most accurate results possible. And creativity. This aspect of AI uses neural networks, rules-based systems, statistical methods, and other AI techniques to generate new images, new text, new music, and new ideas. That is essentially what an AI needs to be considered an AI. And just for good measure, I asked an AI if FNAF had an AI, and it said this. In Five Nights at Freddy's, the enemies, which are animatronic characters, are primarily driven by scripted behaviors rather than sophisticated artificial intelligence. The game is known for its jumpscares and tense atmosphere, but the animatronics generally follow predefined patterns and scripted sequences. The game relies on programmed events and triggers to create the illusion of intelligent and adaptive behavior. The animatronics move through the restaurant based on scripted actions and events that occur during the night, responding to certain conditions rather than learning from player behavior in a dynamic way. While the game creates an intense and suspenseful experience, the underlying AI in Five Nights at Freddy's is more script-driven than based on machine learning or adaptive algorithms. The scripted nature contributes to the game's design, making it more about managing limited resources and reacting quickly to predictable threats. You see the custom night screen here and it says AI level above the numbers. This is a lie. It's not AI. This is just a difficulty slider. On the custom night, you set the number that the RNG is matched against to determine the movement. You remember that set number that Chicken Ninja showed? Well, here we are towards the end. For my closing statement, I suppose, Frictional Games, the developers of Amnesia, The Dark Descent, and Soma, have a blog that's still available to be read. In it, Thomas Grip wrote an entry titled 9 Lessons on Horror. I want to take the time to read just the first 3 lessons from this entry for you to consider when looking at this game. You may do with this what you will. Horror games are quite a different beast when it comes to the game industry at large. Most other genres revolve around what the player does. In a turn-based strategy, you take turns doing strategy. In a first-person shooter, you shoot things from a first-person perspective. In a match 3 game, you match 3 thingies. In a horror game, the activity is not at all as important. What is important is that the experience is a spooky one. This makes designing horror games different from designing within other genres. Many times, the standard industry tricks just won't work, which makes one think about game design in a different light. The basic emotion of horror is not a pleasant one, yet people play horror games wanting to experience horror. This is the paradox of horror as entertainment. The paradox requires game developers to be careful in how they deliver the experience to the player. You could draw an analogy between horror games and roller coasters. The basic purpose of a roller coaster is to simulate the sensation of falling. Under controlled circumstances, the experience of falling is thrilling and fun, at least for a good portion of people. But if you put someone in a barrel and push them down a cliff, chances are they will not find the experience fun at all. Even if they survive unscathed, the whole ordeal would be a horrible experience. The same is true for horror games. If you have a game that only relies on jump scares, figuratively throwing people off a cliff in a barrel, few people would consider that fun. This became apparent in certain maps in Penumbra. We thought it would be good enough for a scary gameplay section to have a maze and some monsters. Instead of becoming mazes of fear, they instantly became mostly annoying. Amnesia: The Dark Descent had similar issues towards the end, where the monster encounters were just that, not supported by any other aspects. At that point, the game no longer felt as entertaining. Some games solve issues of player exploitation simply by making the enemies extremely hard. Think Dark Souls. They make sure the monsters are just as hard to beat as they look scary. Another approach is to instead skip much of the gameplay, think Dear Esther. If there are no mechanics, there's nothing for the player to exploit. Problem solved, right? I don't think either of these solutions is optimal. Instead, I think one should aim for a third route, making the players think about actions in a more narrative fashion. Horror is like a spice that defines a dish. You cannot do without it, but you can't cook a dish solely out of spices either. That would be just gross. As an example, let's take 3 horror movies I consider to be at the top of their genre: Alien, The Exorcist, and Ringu. All 3 movies deal with very different subjects, have different styles, and are overall different from one another. But there is one thing they have in common. They all have very few scares in them. Instead, each movie is mostly about the characters, the discussions, the anticipation of horror, building up the atmosphere and the dread of things to come. Very little time is spent actually facing the horror. Let's get back to our roller coaster analogy. When you think about it, the actual roller coaster ride lasts a very short time. Most of the time is spent doing things like buying a ticket, standing in line, and hearing other people scream. All of these actions are not superfluous extras. They build up for the actual ride and are crucial to the overall experience. When we first made the study section of Amnesia: The Dark Descent, we implemented a ton of jump scares. Books fell down from shelves, doors banged, pianos started playing, and so forth. But as the map became more complete, it felt like something was off. So we reduced the scares to just a couple and instead focused on letting the player learn the castle's mysteries. At first, we were afraid this would make the level too boring, but as it turns out, spacing the scares apart made players much more scared than previously. There's a lot in this post that I believe helps to answer why Sister Location was made the way it was. Does it magically make Sister Location good? Fuck no. But I think it at least puts the design decisions into perspective. And if you're interested in what the rest of this post has to offer but don't have time to read it, but do have time to listen, I will have a reading of this blog available on my second channel, Bowiehunter Offline, either by the time this video is released or soon after. And yeah, that's about it. Every single thing that I said in opposition to his points is why I think Uhyeah is wrong. Not just about Sister Location, but about FNAF as a whole. Hopefully I was able to explain myself a bit better this time, and if you came to the end of this video, even if you think I'm still wrong, I thank you for your time.